Hello, welcome to Interviewing in Qualitative Research. The features of qualitative interviews are that those type of interviews are less structured and standardized. They are more free-flowing and less restrictive in terms of having to complete a set list of questions. The whole interview actually is really directed by the participant, and the participant is allowed to expand and ramble away in providing their answer. And basically, it does enable flexibility in that the questions actually can emerge as a result of the participant's ramblings. And the result of a qualitative interview is quite rich, detailed and expansive amount of answers provided. The key aim of a qualitative interview is to understand rather to generalize, and it's understand that individual's perspective on something rather than a general perspective. And it's a depth of information that you're gathering here. We have opportunities of doing structured, unstructured or semi-structured interviews. Here we're just going to discuss two forms of that, those being unstructured and semi-structured, and another section in this video will discuss structured interviews. Unstructured is basically that. There is no structure, there's no template, there's no sort of backbone of questions that you have devised. There could be some topics that you believe that you need to get, but it doesn't form a rigid list of questions. The questions posed are all open-ended, meaning you are asking things like, can you explain your experience of travelling recently on Bus Éireann? It's very much a conversational style with no boundaries, whereby a semi-structured interview does actually have an interview guide. And an interview guide is a predetermined list of questions that you as the interviewer have actually formulated. But when and where those questions are asked in the interview shows the semi-structured nature behind it, that they can emerge in different locations with different people. So that refers to the flexible question ordering. The types of qualitative interviews could be the life history interview or an oral history interview. So the life history interview is basically a longer time frame. You're asking people to go back and reflect on their whole life and basically ask them to really provide information on their views and interpretations of the social world, on their behaviours and on their development in society during that time frame. And as I say here, it shows how life events have unfolded, and we're trying to find information about those life events unfolding. Whereby an oral history interview is just really the reflection on a specific time frame in the participant's life. How do we actually prepare for these interviews? What should we do if they are maybe semi-structured? Well, with a semi-structured interview, we had talked about an interview guide. This is having a predetermined set of questions. Those questions need to emanate from the topics that you're trying to cover in your interview with the participant. You use comprehensible and relevant language to the participant, and that's where you may have to use different terms and phrases depending on the individual who is answering. You need to avoid leading questions. It needs to be open and it needs to be really emanating from the participants' responses. So preparing for the interview, what do we need to do? We need to understand the life of the participant. You need to basically do some research. If you're trying to do a life history, you need to find out the age and the location of the person, find out what sort of environment they have come from. Get a good quality tape recorder and microphone should you have approval from the Research Ethics Committee to conduct your interview with a tape recording, and also you've got consent from the participant. We'll talk about the setting again in a few minutes and learn how to become a successful interviewer. To become a successful interviewer does actually depend on you conducting a number of interviews. Another way of becoming a successful interviewer is to shadow somebody who has been doing it and is good at doing it. And you can observe the way they can be empathetic, how they can actually have their non-verbal communication, how they steer and maybe bring the participant back to important areas or important topics that are needed to be discussed. Furthermore, Cale actually identified certain criteria of becoming a successful interviewer. And basically the 10 points are: you need to be familiar with the focus of the interview, you need to ensure that you have some key terms and phrases and even questions at the very beginning to make the participant comfortable in the interview, and also then to round it off or finish the interview. Be able to ask clear, concise questions. Don't get jargon involved in the questions, because that's not clear for everybody. Be gentle, and this is something that I do have some issues with personally, that I do interject an awful lot in people providing answers. So it takes some experience to try and make sure that you don't jump into answers. Listen to what is said and how it is being said, and from that might even steer you towards more questions as a result of the non-verbal communication from the interviewee or the participant. Respond to what is important to the interviewee. Don't, discount what is important, because that can even give you more and rich information. Know what he or she wants to find out, and that's you. You need to predetermine what is actually critical to actually being found out, and then steer the questions that way. Number 9 is remembering. Sometimes you may have to reflect on some points or some observations of your participant and reiterating those throughout the interview. And then interpreting. Here you need, at the end of the day, to be able to understand the meaning of the interviewee's statements. And sometimes the non-verbal communication is equally as important as the verbal. So I mentioned before we would talk about the location, and what are the tips or the guidelines for finding a location. First of all, what is imperative is having a quiet, private space to conduct an interview without any interruptions. Right now, I've put the dogs out, I've turned the phones off or they're on quiet, and I've made sure that nobody else is going to call me during this particular videoing of this subject area, because you don't want to have to repeat certain questions or repeat certain information. I would be hesitant in agreeing to having an interview in the individual's own office, because it could be quite an easy opportunity for them to say, look, I have to go and meet Joe Bloggs, or his or her PA may come in and interrupt, or the telephone may go off. So be careful about that situation. And then think about the environment. Think about maybe extraneous noises that could actually interfere in maybe the recording, or even the ability for the participant to hear and understand you. It's very important as you in developing your interview skills is to be reflective. And what I suggest is that you should make notes after the interview, just in general. Reflect on how did the interview go. Was the interviewee talkative? Was it a good interview, or was it quite stilted? Where did the interview take place? Was it a good place? Was it a bad place? What could have been done differently? What was the setting like? Do you need to actually reflect on that and maybe change the location for future interviews? So we mentioned the interview guide, and this is really in use for the semi-structured interviews. And how do we actually formulate the questions for an interview guide? And this is, in a sense, a step-by-step process. So first of all, you need to know what you're researching and what area you're going to be looking at. And then from that, you need to maybe develop specific research questions. And then within those questions, you need to devise interview topics. Then formulate the interview questions, revise, revisit interview questions, and even here you could pilot those interview questions with some potential participants. Maybe then from the feedback, identify novel issues, then revise interview questions, and then finalize the guide. So very much this is for the semi-structured. In an unstructured, you would not have an interview guide, though you would obviously have some topics that you need to discuss, but you wouldn't necessarily have any formulated questions. So what kind of questions might you actually be asking? Well, this is how you, it all depends really on the topics, but it could be asking for them to tell you about something, or maybe following up on an experience they had, or you may have to ask probing questions. Can you expand on that a bit more? Can you explain that in more detail? You may actually be specifying, well, expand on what happened next. You may actually have to have a structuring question, like as, let's move on to some topic that you know specifically you haven't touched on that you actually need to have asked. Silence here actually could result in a question coming out from the participant saying, you know, would you like to hear more? And then you obviously say yes or no. Another kind of question could be an interrupting type question. Sorry, that should say interrupting. Do you mean that? And expand. So with your questions being asked, recording and transcription, well, again, if you have approval to record, this actually does help you. It enables you to not have to take notes, and you can then really just focus in on the body language, on the words, on the context of the interviewee. It corrects your memory. Now, I know myself, my memory's gone to the dogs, so I would prefer to have an interview with a recorder with me. Or I may have to bring somebody to actually take down the notes for me. But again, this has to be approved by the research ethics and also by the participant. Transcription actually does save time. Getting maybe somebody to actually transcribe it for you who's a fast typist, and if you are looking for anybody, I've got the names of somebody located in our area if you need it. But again, you have to pay per page transcription, and it could be maybe €2 to €3 per page. How do we know who to actually interview, how many to interview? Well, when we were discussing in topic 3B1, the nature of qualitative research, we mentioned Eisenhardt and Coulding's position on between 8 and 28, or somebody else said 30 interviews. Well, basically you have three sampling methods here, and that's strategic, and that's the first one. Select interviewees who are relevant to research questions. So I know specifically there's 8 people in my class who could answer questions pertaining to Irish dancing, hypothetically say, and there I'm being strategic to target those 8 or 12 individuals. Snowball sampling is useful when there is no sampling frame. That means you've got no upper limit. But snowball sampling actually is that you ask somebody else, somebody that you've interviewed, to maybe recommend somebody else. And then you ask that next person to recommend somebody else for you. And then you actually stop when you start to hear repetition in answers. Theoretical sampling focuses on emerging theory rather than statistical adequacy of sample. You select until research theoretical saturation, until you reach theoretical saturation. However, we don't know when that situation will come about. It only comes about once you actually reflect on the data that you have, and then you say, actually, we have reached theoretical saturation. Comparing and contrasting participant observation versus qualitative interviewing. So observing how people actually interact with each other, being immersed in the environment of the individual and observing the participants, you are seeing through each other's eyes. You then become a member of the community and you learn the language, the non-verbal communication, the cultural aspects of the individuals and also the society. So here we're not actually interviewing people on a one-to-one basis in observation. We're actually immersing ourselves in the collective cohort of individuals. It enables you to actually become part of their society and start to understand how things emerge, how thoughts and observations come about. The advantages of qualitative interviewing over participant observation is you basically find out issues rather than trying to immerse yourself and make a formal conclusion from the observation. In qualitative interviewing, there's a lot more reflective aspects, and one can actually reflect on certain periods in time or on specific events, whereby observation you can't, because you're turning the observation into a qualitative interview if you're asking for the reflective aspects. It's less intrusive in a qualitative interview over participant observation. You're enabling following up and also replication of the interviews if you have the qualitative interview guide. So that's the end of looking at unstructured, semi-structured qualitative research approaches. We looked at qualitative interviewing and then looked briefly at participant observation and their advantages, and then compared them with qualitative interviewing. We have mentioned structured interviewing, and next we're going to explain what's involved, how is it involved, and how to actually conduct it. So what is structured interviewing? This is basically a quantitative research approach. Excuse me. It's often used in social surveys. You have a standardized interview schedule, and it's a standardized interview schedule across all the participants that you are actually interviewing. So each participant gets the same questions in the same way, in the same order. You may have closed, pre-coded, or fixed choice questions. The benefits of a structured interview is the replication of it and the lack of variation, in that there's going to be consistency across the interviews, whereby the unstructured interview, each one is different, each one has a different answer, different theme, different emergence of questions, whereby a structured interview is very limited in terms of flexibility. So what are the advantages of structured interviewing? It reduces error due to interviewer variability, in a sense that there's differences in responses only due to true variation, and that is true variation of the interviewee's interpretation of the answers, not inconsistencies in the conduct of interviews. The questions are standardized across all the interviews, and the participants will have the same wording and the same questions posed to them. The accuracy and ease of data processing emerges as a result of conducting a structured interview, in a sense that you have closed-ended, pre-coded or fixed choice questions. There isn't the open-ended questions where you have to look for themes or look for content that is common across different answers. You don't have to interpret responses because those responses are pre-ordered or predetermined. The standardized coding frame reduces variability in coding procedure, in that the coding procedure is the same across the board for everybody and there's no variance in that. However, there is error involved in survey research, and that could be dependent on the actual questionnaire itself, in that it could be poorly worded and poorly phrased. Maybe if you are doing a one-to-one structured interview with a candidate, and maybe it is the interviewer themselves who are actually poor in phrasing the questions, or even their verbal communication could actually cause for error to occur. Maybe the interviewee themselves actually has misunderstanding of what is being asked. Maybe they're not able to remember certain things. Maybe it's because of the recording held by or performed by the interviewer. Maybe it's actually the way the data is actually processed through the statistical package or even the coding method. So some questions to ask when you're involved in interviewing and involved in structured interviewing. Do we have more than one interviewee? Do we have a focus group? Maybe we do group interviews. Do we have more than one interviewer? Maybe we have 2 or 3 interviewers. Do we do it face-to-face, maybe over the phone? Do we use the computer to assist us in interviewing? These are questions you as an interviewer need to actually ask yourself, and maybe resources could be an issue in determining which of these methods to adopt. Just some points here about telephone interviewing. It is cheap, it is quick. Nearly everybody nowadays does have a telephone. It is quite easy to monitor and evaluate. And you can, in a sense, get immediate responses, and also you can get immediate feedback. However, even though I say here that people do own phones, not all are contactable, in that they could be ex-directory. A telephone interview should not be very long. You cannot have a half-hour or an hour telephone interview. You need short, snappy questions, and those questions need to be mainly closed questions, if not even dichotomous questions. When conducting structured interviews, I recommend that you actually know your interview guide, know your way around it, and know what's involved. You need to introduce the research, and going back to your research ethics form, you need to make sure that you actually inform the individual about their right to refuse and also withdraw at any time. You need to identify yourself, explain the purpose of the research and how the interview is going to happen, and you need to explain that up front. Once again, reflecting on the ethics decisions that you have made prior to the research happening, you need to consider the anonymity and confidentiality issues. You need to know whether or not you can allow the interviewee to ask questions, or do you want those questions at the very end? So when conducting structured interviews, you need to build rapport. And that rapport is actually difficult to generate if you have a very short time frame. You need to keep to the interview schedule that you actually have devised. And as I say here, even small variations in wording can affect responses. When you are conducting structured interviews, do record exactly the words given by the interviewee, or use fixed choice questions, meaning yes, no, or using strongly agree, agree, no view, disagree, strongly disagree, so a ranking type question. You need to give clear instructions. Some questions are not relevant to every interviewee, so in a sense you need to ask the interviewee if it is relevant to them. If, for example, it's a male respondent question and you're asking an interviewee who is female, you need to say, this next question doesn't apply to you because of the gender issue. Every interviewee must get questions in the same order. It is recommended to have general questions before specific questions, and sometimes the basic demographic questions, the nice, easy questions, can be upfront before the specific ones. It is recommended potentially embarrassing or sensitive questions are put towards the end. One clear reason here is that if you ask these embarrassing or sensitive questions at the beginning, the interviewee may actually say, "I'm not answering this questionnaire," and walk away. Whereby if they stop towards the end of the interview, at least you have some responses that they may agree for you to include as part of the study. In terms of probing, when respondents do not understand questions or give insufficient answers, you should actually do some probing. Get clarification that they understood the question, or maybe provide them with the question again. So repeat the fixed choice alternatives. Watch for prompting. Watch for suitable answers, but have those answers for everybody. Don't just have them for a select few. Maybe you might have to show some visuals to give them an idea of what you are asking questions about. But again, all of those should be shown to everybody and not just a select or random few. And then leaving the interview, thank the interviewee, and debriefing should be minimal. You should just say, "Thank you very much, I appreciate your time, and if you have any other questions, please do not hesitate in contacting me." And you can give them a contact number. Finally, we're going to finish off with looking at problems with structured interviews. Basically, the characteristic of the interviewers: age, gender, ethnicity, class, all of those can actually even direct the responses by the interviewee. Because maybe the interviewee is feeling that this individual, because of their own class or ethnicity, may want to hear these specific answers. People may respond in consistent but irrelevant ways by acquiescence, meaning agreeing or disagreeing to all questions, or for reasons of social desirability, so that the interviewees reflect on the way their answers might be perceived. But we want to try and get as true and honest and realistic questions. So maybe you have to rephrase those questions if you are seeing this acquiescence or social desirability answers coming through. The problem of meaning. The interviewee themselves may have a problem in understanding the interpretation of what you're actually posing to them in terms of the question. So the interviewer and respondent may not attribute the same meaning to concepts. The meaning of questions is not pre-given, but rather constructed in the interview. And finally, the feminist critique. Structured interviews epitomise the imbalance of power between researcher and informant. Interviewers extract information from passive respondents and give nothing in return. Researchers' values and personal involvement are a strength, not a weakness. However, it tends to favour qualitative research generally. Now, I hope this video on interviewing in qualitative research has been helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.